Okay, so for my final project, I decided to do Jimi Hendrix. I chose him because he's one of my brother's favorite artists. Overall, Jimi Hendrix was known for two things. He was known for, this his style on the electric guitar, and he was also known for uh drugs, for doing drugs. His original name was Johnny Allen Hendrix. Um, his father changed it to James Marshall once he gained custody of Jimmy. Later on, obviously, Jimmy picked what he wanted to be called and what he wanted to be named. He is originally from Seattle, Washington. His father encouraged him to play guitar. His father was one of his influences during this time. He had plenty of influences, and as he got older and he got really good at the guitar, he was able to play under bigger artists, one being Little Richard. When people think of Jimi Hendrix, they think of him as a solo artist, because people only really talk about him and what he has done on the guitar. They don't talk about the fact that he had a manager and he had his bassist and drummer with him. He Chas Chandler saw him performing and saw kind of what he could do with the guitar, and Chas kind of took a chance on him and decided to become his manager. Chas was originally the bass player for the Animals, so he really took a jump to try to help Jimmy get somewhere. Chas then introduced Jimmy to both Noel Redding and Mitch Mitchell, which is the bassist and the drummer. All three of the instrumentalists worked very well together. They were very good at what they did. They were able to work around each other and allow Jimmy to perform the way he wanted to and to create music the way he wanted to. They worked very well together. You couldn't ask for a better group. He considered these men, all three of them, his team. He relied on them. He allowed them to kind of help him push him forward. They had held many concerts. They had many concerts in the UK and many concerts in the US, but he really didn't have any tours. Probably because, he didn't want to do it. It's stressful to do a tour. His music type. So, Jimmy, was able to get his inspiration from a lot of different people. He did pull the psychedelic, tones from the artists of the time, and then he also brought in the heavy blues and funk rhythms from older artists. Some of his inspirations were artists such as Buddy Holly, Eddie Cochran, Muddy Waters, Elvin James, Albert King, and B.B. King. He did have a label, and it was mainly just to get material out to people. And the two labels were Track Records and Polydor Records, and they're both actually based in the UK. Really, everything he did was started in the UK and eventually came over to the US, even though he is a US citizen. But next, obviously, his instrumentation would be his electric guitar. He was a very good electric guitar player. He could play like nobody had ever seen before, pretty much. He was also the main songwriter for his band. He was innovative and creative. He was very experimental. He wasn't afraid to try something new with the guitar. He was able to kind of achieve a different sound than most rock artists at that time, and that's partially because of his roots, as being able to grow up with influences such as B.B. King and heavy blues and funk music. He built on that with, the kind of music that was floating around during that time, which was the psychedelia music. He was very great on guitar. He was known for using for his sonic innovations, employing feedback and vibrato bar on the guitar. And then he soon was imitated by many other artists. Another thing about him and his band actually was that he would go and record a song, and like a lot of recording people that recorded with him were just amazed with what he would come up with. But he'd record a song, and then afterwards, he'd go to a concert and he'd go perform the song live, and it was totally different. He felt that, you should not have the same on the record as in live performance. If you wanted the same exact thing, you might as well have stayed home and not come to the concert. The concert is to kind of, he felt, was to show off your skills, to kind of, show off your improv and how you can make your song different every time. So he never really played his song the same way. And that's really kind of important to understand about him, just how much musical improv he used, and not only, his concerts, but in everything he did with his music. Music stats. So I was actually surprised when I looked up the Billboard Hot 100 and found that he had 0 number 1 hits, 0 top 10 hits, and only 7 songs on the top 100. I guess that kind of surprised me because he was such, I felt as if he was this huge artist, but then it kind of struck me, when I looked at the Billboard 200, he did have a number 1 hit. He did have 10 top 10 hits, and then he had 49 total songs on there. And I think some of that was because he was coming over from the UK and then to the US, and that's where, people really didn't know him as well in the US as they did in the UK, and I think that made a big difference in his music stats and things like that. Now we're going to talk about underground psychedelia. This became huge, and I mean absolutely huge during this time period. This was located in London, and it was young people who questioned topics that were heavily debated, such as radical politics, Eastern philosophy, and, experimental music. They also talked about race and gender and, every other thing you could think of that was highly debated during that time period. The music that was made during the underground psychedelia was really for 2 things. It was really just for drugs, but it was either to enhance, the drugs you were taking, or it was to make the music you were listening to feel as if you were on drugs. Soon enough, psychedelia was everywhere in London. There was no way to hide it. It became huge. Jimmy got lucky and he received what's called commercial success, which means he was actually succeeding outside of London and outside of the underground. So he was able to actually make it out of the underground, which most artists at that time did not. So next we're going to talk about drugs. Drugs were big during this time period. A lot of people used LSD and acid trips to unlock their perception, to become more enlightened, to kind of open up this creativity and an innovative way of making music, or to understand music in a different light. Most artists at this time were on drugs. Didn't matter what kind of drugs it was, they were on a drug. Jimi Hendrix was also on drugs. He was actually heavily leaned on drugs by the end of the 60s, and actually in 1970 he overdosed on drugs, and it's what killed him. He died because of an overdose, and that was pretty much obviously the end of his career, end of anything. And really, he didn't get his start till 1966, so he only really got 4 years of fame, which is amazing as an artist. But before we can even think about that, before his career, you're wondering what he's doing. Yes, he was playing underneath, but what people don't know is that he actually served in the Vietnam War. And obviously during this time, that was a huge deal because there was mass protesting. People felt as if we shouldn't have been involved in it. We shouldn't have tried to get ourselves involved in what was going on in Vietnam. It wasn't our, place to say that. So, the biggest mass protesting that I can remember hearing about in school was the peaceful protesting on the college campus that soon turned unpeaceful when the cops came in and tear gassed a bunch of these college students. And I think a couple college students were actually killed due to police officers, shooting their guns at them. Later on, towards the end of his career and end of his life, he reconnected with his war buddies and actually created a band with them. It never really took off. They released songs, but it didn't really, nobody really listened to them. Overall, it was not a success at all. One of his most famous performances took place at Woodstock Festival. Woodstock was huge during this time. Major artists at this time performed there. Artists such as like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, they all performed there. So for him to get his chance to perform at the Woodstock Festival was pretty cool. And I mean, the only thing he really, that concert, he was performing the Star Spangled Banner, our national anthem in the U.S. So it was amazing to see that, the fans there were actually responding to his guitar playing, and they were really moved by it, and they were impressed by it, so he decided to kick it up a notch, and he actually became destructive and lit his guitar on fire to, really, hype people up more. And, this kind of jump-started his career into the U.S. and into the music in the U.S., and it really helped him achieve the spotlight that he did. After that, all of his concerts, it soon became known that he was to be destructive, to break his guitars, set them on fire multiple times. That was just something he always did. Overall, though, people loved it. That was something cool that he did. For my last thing, for my two songs, I chose Purple Haze and Voodoo Child. I chose these two because they're, Purple Haze was in the beginning of his career, and Voodoo Child was more towards the end of his career. Purple Haze is, it's got a lot more chords. It's not so singled out and bright. It's, it's not as upbeat, and it's more fits along with the psychedelic rock that, was being produced at that time. Whereas Voodoo Child, was more bright. It was upbeat. You had the one chords. You didn't really have, you had the single stringing of the notes and stuff. Some amazing solos within it, and it had more of a blues feeling to it. It just had a totally different tone than Purple Haze, and you can see how he would make one song more psychedelic and add a little tiny bit of blues, or he'd have tons of blues kind of music in it and kind of have a little bit of that psychedelic phase into it. And I think that's important to understand about him, is the amount of mixture and creativity he put into his music to make it the way it was. Overall, Jimi Hendrix became one of the best known guitarists throughout history through what he did. He was an amazing guitarist, and he paved the way for new artists to create music that, had never been heard before. And here is my reference.